I'm so glad Jeff is here. As I told you, Jim Oliver and I spoke, and Jim had a connection to Mr. Gardner with Amtrak in D.C. We had a very productive discussion about a couple main themes of which I'm hoping Jeff's going to talk about, but essentially Mr. Gardner said, you know, the guy to have us come down, if you're willing to take the time to hear what he has to say, is Jeff Mann. I think, Jeff, your job is to look at emerging corridors and hopefully expansions of Amtrak. So he's got that perspective. But the other thing is, this is somebody that's actually operating, and I think you ought to use this opportunity after he gets done. If there's anything you want to pick his brain about, you know, to have him come here. He came in down yesterday, I guess, yesterday evening. To have him come here and spend the time, you ought to take advantage to pick his brain, because, you know, I think you're going to hear some things that are going to be very useful in how we strategize our next move.
Well, we certainly do welcome you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. We appreciate the opportunity, and certainly it's always great to see such enthusiastic. Can you guys hear me okay? Can you hear me now?
Go ahead.
All right. Is that all right? Yeah. It's always great to see such enthusiastic discussion and attendance here to talk about Passenger Rail. That's always refreshing. I'll make one promise at the outset. I don't have as many alternatives or steps as Kevin's presentation, so you can be assured of that. It is great to be here, and as Dwight indicated, my job at Amtrak is to build off-corridor services, and off-corridor we define as anything outside of Boston or Washington on the East Coast. I'm going to have a mic put on here. Is that on? Okay, is that better? Okay. I'll just speak loudly. Usually folks have trouble getting me to be quiet, so it shouldn't be a problem. First thing I want to do, just real briefly, is walk you through, and I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll skip through some of this very quickly. Stop me if you have questions or want to expand on something. But to real briefly go over our background, Amtrak's, and how we're doing in fiscal year 08 and fiscal year 09, which just ended at the end of September for Amtrak. And then get into the meat of the presentation. I think what you want to hear about is how has Amtrak's world changed and the world of passenger rail, intercity and high speed, due to the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act, which we call PRIA, which was enacted into law October a year ago, October 17th. And then talk a little bit about how we're approaching, Amtrak's approaching high-speed rail and corridor development. Most folks here have probably ridden an Amtrak train and you're familiar with our background, but just real briefly, I'll roll through it. We began operation in May of 1971 to relieve the freight railroads of their common carrier passenger obligation because it had become quite unprofitable to operate passenger services, due in large part due to investment in other modes, federal investment. We operate a 21,000-mile system, and we serve a total of 527 stations throughout the country. We own and operate the Northeast Corridor between Boston and Washington. That's what we call our spine, Northeast Corridor spine segment, as well as the Philadelphia to Harrisburg line and some other trackage in Michigan. Last year, in fiscal year 09, we had our second highest ridership ever. 08 was the best, and that was 27.2 million passengers we carried last fiscal year. We view our services as falling into three categories. The Northeast Corridor, which is largely but not entirely owned by Amtrak. The long distance network, and that's routes that are either overnight or have a length of greater than 750 miles. And then our short distance trains, like the regional trains that serve Newport News via Richmond and Washington and on to the Northeast Corridor up to Boston. Those are those routes under 750 miles almost always. And most of those are state-supported routes where a state will pay Amtrak or reimburse Amtrak for operating losses to operate those services. Bottom line, 70% of our train miles, even counting the Northeast Corridor where we run a lot of frequencies, are over railroads other than Amtrak. And this, I don't know if you can see this, I apologize that the font's very small, but this is our national route network and which host railroads that we operate over by territory. As I mentioned a moment ago, 2008 was a great year for Amtrak. We had record ridership and revenue. which really demonstrated passenger rail's relevance in an age of congestion, highway and airport congestion, and high fuel prices. You remember we had $4 gasoline. We didn't have enough seats on the train or enough cars to put on trains. 09 will not be as strong, and I actually put a little bit of this together before we finished 08, and as indicated a few minutes ago, was not quite as strong. As opposed to about 28.5 million trips, we had about 27.2. Still a very strong year, our second best ever, which we are encouraged by given the tough economic conditions. And that's just a quick chart showing you where we've been the last 4 years. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but this chart gives you an indication of our demand for intercity rail services by market segment or by trip purpose. As you can tell, business is about 41% of Amtrak's ridership, most of that on the Northeast Corridor, and in these corridor services of less than 750 miles where we have multiple frequencies. And ideally, we're trip time competitive with the auto and perhaps the air mode given the distance. And 47%, almost 50%, are non-business trips. That's leisure, visiting friends, families, other reasons. And about 3.2 million trips are purely commuting to and from work, primarily on a daily basis. Let's talk about PRIA, the Passenger Rail Investment Improvement Act, which really changed the rules of the game for passenger rail, how we operate and how we'll operate going forward. PRIA provides a very clear vision for Amtrak and intercity passenger rail within the National Transportation Scheme, which we really didn't have before. It establishes a new partnership with the federal government, the states or authorities, Amtrak and our host railroad partners, where those partners now are the primary planning arm of planning new services. You talked a lot about the draft EIS that's been put together, Kevin's put together in DRPT for this quarter. States will be taking a lead in those efforts, much more so than they have in the past under PRIA. The U.S. DOT, through the Federal Railroad Administration, it's their job to try to pull it all together into a national network and administer those grant programs and make those key decisions as to where the grant funds will flow. It's our job, Amtrak, to operate a national network and help the states and help authorities and help the FRA to design those national systems and help with the planning effort as to cost-benefit assessment, ridership analysis, and lend our technical expertise in that area. As you know, the PRIA was funded through the stimulus funds, American Recovery and ARA, the stimulus money of $8 billion. Yeah, Recovery and Reinvestment Act, I guess. Thank you. What are the new roles? We talked about it for a minute. States are the lead partners. They're creating the rail plans, and we've assisted a lot of states in that effort with the Round 1 applications. They will function as the federal grant recipients. The states will, or authorities in some cases. They are eligible to receive grant funds, and we deal with several authorities, not only states. They'll provide operating and capital funding for Amtrak services, whereas a lot of states, we now have 15 state partners that support 20 routes, Amtrak routes, and that's actually 47% of our average weekday departures are now state-supported trains. All of those falling into that off Northeast Corridor, 750 mile or less category. The FRA will lead the national policy through national rail planning, safety and performance standards, administering grant programs, and facilitation among partners, the states, the Amtrak, and the freights. So essentially, we're a nonprofit co-op to help facilitate intercity rail operations and development. We're rebuilding to live up to that challenge. We're rebuilding our capacity internally to assist states in the planning effort and the engineering planning efforts. We had really become pretty weak in that area. From 2002 to 2008, we were actually barred from spending any resources on planning new services. So we didn't have a strategic planning department, which we're rebuilding. We didn't have the capabilities that the states need and are going to look to Amtrak to provide to assist them in this new world as a result of PRIA going forward. But we're developing that, and we're trying to become a little bit more nimble, a little bit more flexible, and more capable of assisting the states. Let's talk about the high-speed and intercity rail investment. We talked about ARA. ARA really funds PRIA. PRIA sets up grant programs for high-speed and intercity rail development. ARA funds those grant programs. The grants require enduring state leadership commitment with both operating and capital funds. I think Kevin's presentation on just a draft EIS gave you a picture of the many steps and how long it takes to work through one of these grant applications and be successful and have all your ducks in a row and all the check marks that you have to be successful. It's a very long process. The Southeast High-Speed Rail Corridor, of which Virginia and North Carolina have cooperated in putting together the environmental documentation and the planning and the engineering work, that's been 10 years in the making to get it to a point where they could put an application in. As we said a minute ago, Amtrak has a number of roles where we can be a grant recipient in some cases. We can lead or partner with states for funding. We can help bridge multiple state projects. We can be a service planner, which we've done a lot of lately. A liaison among states or regions, which we've done a lot of lately. And we obviously are a service provider of state-supported long-distance and high-speed services. When you talk about how we look at expanding new routes, and we've done a lot of that in the last 3 or 4 years, even before PRIA. Since 2005, we had added about 20 daily round trips, state-supported services. Just this year, we've, with the state of Virginia's help, we've added a new train to Lynchburg, and we'll add a new round trip to Richmond. We have a lot of success stories, but what do we look at when we agree to start pursuing a new route? And the big thing is you have to look at the parameters of the route, the trips per day, the trip time, and how many delay minutes are acceptable. Last thing we want to do is add a new route that's unsuccessful due to OTP problems, or the trip time's not competitive, or there's not enough frequency for it really to matter. We work hand in hand with states and with authorities and with regions in order to plan these services, and make sure also with our host railroad partners that we don't lessen their ability to do business, because they're economic drivers as well. And no one will win if we add a passenger train and that only hurts the freight railroad operation. So it's critical that we work with those freight railroad partners to determine what improvements are needed in order to not only hold them harmless, but allow them to operate as well or better than before the passenger train was introduced. So the public sector really provides the funding to build it right through the grant programs we've mentioned and some private matching or state matching. And the host railroads, we want them to make an enforceable commitment to run it right, provided that we fund the infrastructure that's necessary to run it right. And if we do that, we have examples where a well-functioning system benefits everybody. When you're looking at a new corridor, as you folks are down the south side or the south bank, you really, I think, have to look at the need and then let that kind of drive the investment solutions, whether or not it's emerging high-speed rail or true high-speed rail. And those route characteristics that you have to look at when determining what are the needs of a particular corridor are clearly the number of freight trains on the route in question, the number of passenger trains, that will tell you how much capacity is left, the relative speeds versus freight and passenger, vice versa, and train size and weight, and as to what infrastructure is required in order to operate efficiently. I want to go back to that real briefly. One thing that I think you also have to look at, and I haven't heard a lot of today, but we think is critical, is it's not really productive to look at a corridor. For example, this corridor, Richmond to Hampton roads, in isolation. I can tell you from our experience in developing corridors, especially on the East Coast where we have a northeast corridor spine that's very strong, that you have to look at the overall markets. Is the market really Richmond to Hampton roads, or is it Hampton roads to Washington, or is it Hampton roads to Philadelphia, New York, and Boston? And how will you integrate into that overall corridor? For example, we found that a transfer, if you force a passenger to transfer, if you had, for example, a very high-speed train service up to Richmond, but then transferred to an Amtrak regional service that we would consider emerging high-speed, that transfer can penalize the ridership opportunity by as much as almost half. A one-seat ride is that critical. So a lot of folks will look at a corridor. Raleigh to Charlotte's a prime example. They've done a lot of work. It's a successful corridor. It's growing. We'll add a new daily round trip for the third daily round trip in March to that corridor. But the real market is Charlotte to Raleigh to Richmond to Washington. And so you have to view these corridors and these segments of a corridor as an integral part of a larger picture. And you always have to keep that in mind. It won't do you a heck of a lot of good to operate at 200 miles per hour to Richmond only have someone transfer to operate at 90 miles per hour to Washington, and then obviously northeast corridor up to 135. So we have to plan regionally, and that region is much bigger than just a one segment of the corridor. I've probably hit a couple of these successful collaboration examples of where we're expanding partnerships now. Washington State, we just added a new train up to Vancouver. In Virginia, to regional trains to Lynchburg and soon to Richmond. North Carolina will add a third daily round trip ride to Charlotte. Before too long, we'll be adding service out to Rockford. And Maine, we're going to extend service to Brunswick and probably add additional round trips. Wisconsin service out to Madison, and hopefully service along the east coast of Florida on the Florida East Coast Railway, which we don't serve at all today. These are just some of the projects that Amtrak is working on now as far as expanding services. None of these are true high speed. Some of these are emerging high speed. Most of these are conventional. So if you look at the different approaches to high speed rail, the Big Bang, and that'd be building a new corridor. It's grade separated. It's entirely passenger and operated speeds, 150 mile per hour plus. We really don't have any of that in the United States now. Our Acela train, which operates at speeds of 150 miles per hour for a segment of its route in Rhode Island, does not exceed 150 miles per hour, and in many segments operates far slower than that. In fact, a lot of folks probably don't know that the Acela, although it reaches 135 miles per hour between New York and Washington, it only averages 83. But even averaging 83 miles per hour, that service has commanded 65+% of the combined air rail market. It's in large part due to airport congestion, obviously, and the highway alternative is not very good in the northeast corridor. But those are all factors that have to go in the market decision of is it worth going Big Bang. Obviously, there's a huge capital cost to building an entirely new corridor to operate trains at 150 plus. Extensive land use issues, as you could imagine, and it takes years, sometimes decades, to plan, and sometimes it takes almost that long to plan emerging high-speed corridors, but it'll take even longer for an entirely new corridor. The other alternatives, incremental improvement, and that's making improvements obviously as you go along, going from 79 to 90 and perhaps 110, adding frequencies and trying to become market competitive without building an entirely new corridor. They can begin pretty quickly in most cases, and we've seen some impressive results. As I mentioned, the Acela commanding 65+% of the air rail market. Limited capital costs as opposed to the Big Bang approach, and they're easier to integrate into existing passenger rail networks. And that's the part that I think is absolutely critical. View this as a regional network and understand where the markets are really are. Quick comparison of one of both, the Big Bang approach and a line in Spain, and then also our recent improvements that we made to the Philadelphia to Harrisburg corridor. That's a 100-mile corridor, 104. We restored electrification to go to 110. We were operating at 90. And we upgraded turnouts, made basically about $150 million of improvements, and our ridership's up about 20%. So we've gotten a good return on that investment, no question. We took 15 minutes out of trip time, added 4 daily round trips, and that's been a real success. That's not a minor investment. Certainly $145 million is a lot of money. We feel like the return on that investment is pretty impressive. A line of a similar distance, entirely new line at high speed, 110-mile, 111-mile line in Spain, costs almost $5.9 billion. However, it took 25 minutes out of the trip time and operates at 186 miles per hour. And of course, the ridership probably doubled or more. But it's two approaches to it. One is very expensive. The other, obviously, less so. But you got to look at return investment and how it integrates into the broader network as well. We covered a little bit of this. The Northeast Corridor services are a product of incremental development. They're really not true high speed today. We operated only about 100 miles per hour top speed in 1976 on a good day due to track conditions. 125 miles per hour in the 1980s with the Metroliner service, and then the Acela product, which came online in 2001, allows us to operate at 135 on the south end from Washington to New York, and 150 from New York up to Boston. And the market share is a product of all those things that we talked about, the utility of the rail mode as opposed to the air mode and as opposed to highway. So frequency is a big part of it, not just trip time. but also the cost of the rail service and the convenience. And as you can see, I doubt you can really read that chart, but Washington to New York, our combined market share is about 63%. I actually believe it's up over 65% in 09 from what I understand. And then New York to Boston, where we only average 66 miles per hour, New York to Boston, with the Acela. Even though it operates at 150, we're commanding right at half the air rail market share. Maybe the air service is that bad, I don't know. And then, of course, you want to think about the diminishing marginal returns from investment, and I think that's sort of straightforward. But at some point, obviously, you pick the low fruit off the tree in, obtaining trip time improvements and frequencies. And as you invest more and more into a corridor, those minutes or those additional frequencies become more and more expensive because you've obviously picked off the low fruit, if you will. So where is the sweet spot? One example is that the south end of the Northeast Corridor is so congested today with so much commuter traffic. We have freight traffic on the Northeast Corridor. A lot of folks don't realize that. We have regional trains and we have high-speed trains. To take 15 minutes today out of the trip time between New York and Washington and bring it to a state of good repair to allow us to operate faster, to make the 15 minutes in trip time improvement will cost almost $6.5 billion. Just that 15 minutes. Useful gains, no question, but what could we do with $6.5 billion? Just a few examples. We could bring our entire system into compliance with ADA. Our trains are today, but many stations are not. That'd be about $1.6 billion, we estimate. We could raise the top speed between Chicago and St. Louis to 110 for about $2 billion. And you could build the Richmond to Charlotte corridor with a 110 mile per hour operation between Raleigh and Petersburg. That's sort of greenfield development where a railroad existed once, the old Seaboard Airline. Those tracks are no longer there. You would tie into it with this South Bank service. You could build that at 110 to Raleigh and then 90 all the way to Charlotte for $4 billion. And this slide's a little incorrect. That 110 dedicated line between Raleigh and Petersburg would actually be improvements all the way from Richmond to Charlotte for about $4 billion. And that would include the 90 mile per hour, that's the $1 billion below. So where do we go from here? When you're planning new intercity and higher speed rail services or high speed rail services, the vision for high speed rail that the FRA put out, we believe the FRA is favoring an incremental approach, and the funding levels indicate an incremental approach. Clearly, in California and Florida and some other areas, folks are looking at a dedicated new 150 mile per hour plus high-speed rail system. We talked about $8 billion. $8 billion is a lot of money. Would it build, how many true high-speed rail systems would it build? 100-mile track in Spain was $6 billion. That's not out of line of what it would cost here. It may be low. So we think the funding levels are going to lean more towards incremental development and less additional funds are put in addition to the $8 billion, and substantial additional funds for that matter. PREA gives the FRA administrator authority to facilitate that entire process. We talked about the new roles. And I think we have to keep in mind that all the parties involved here have needs. The host railroads, our freight partners that are here today, CSX and Norfolk Southern, they obviously need to retain capacity to grow their business. It's in everybody's benefit that they grow that freight business, and it helps us take trucks off congested highways, and that can help everybody and bring new jobs and industry. Passenger rail carriers, we need access to their assets to freight railroads in order to build new corridors, no question, and to accommodate service at higher speeds. And the public has an interest in making sure that the $8 billion is spent in a wise manner, that there's some return to that investment. Be happy to field any questions you have.
Any questions?
Yes, sir.
Please.
Mr. Mann, I'm looking at your presentation about Amtrak has many roles. You can apply right now for funds as Amtrak to support improvements on the peninsula without any further designation, can't you?
No, actually, we would have to apply in partnership as a joint application with the state partner in that case. We can only apply in the Northeast Corridor for congestion mitigation. It's called Section 302 of PREA funds outside of the Northeast Corridor. And we can't even apply for high-speed Section 501 funds. Kevin, is it 501? In the Northeast Corridor, because it's not a federally designated high-speed. All that to say we would have to apply in coordination.
But you got the Lynchburg from Charlottesville
Right.
because you had the cooperation of the Commonwealth.
That's
in order
correct.
to apply for grant funds, right?
Actually, no ARM grant funds were used for that project.
No what?
No stimulus grant
I
funds. were used.
understand that. That was the point. I mean, you can apply for federal funds outside of the stimulus process with the cooperation of the Commonwealth.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I'll object, help you out, Mr. Mann. The Lynchburg service improvements were actually funded through the Virginia Transportation Act of 2005. So that was a General Assembly action.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
that was
Those
a
are state funds.
only project.
Okay, but,
Right.
well, help me, maybe I'm, mistaken, but you have built the Peninsula route with federal funds largely, isn't that true?
We've operated it with federal funds. We haven't invested
Okay.
capital except the use of our equipment.
Okay, could you apply for Federal Railroad Administration, FRA funds to support improvements on the peninsula outside of the stimulus process?
If the answer, Mr. Chairman, is yes, it would be a cooperative agreement between Amtrak, DRPT. We would be the applicant, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
We would apply.
Kevin.
Yes, outside of the ERA process, there is a small pot of money right now for intercity passenger rail.
So the answer would be, you could do that,
You could,
right?
yes, sir.
Okay.
And that would be for capitalization, Mr. Franklin.
For capital. I understand that part. Okay.
And that, just so you'll know, that pot of money nationwide was 90 million in
It's
pre,
very small.
90 million
Very small.
total.
Any other questions? Joe?
Mr. Mann, I have a hard time thinking of a national high-speed rail system that does not have one-seat service to Hampton Road. How do we attack that?
Well, it's a good point, and I think having one seat is absolutely critical and improves itself out time and time again. When we plan new services, we often have a point where we would like to operate two types of equipment, for example, maybe a DMU from down up in Vermont due to the loadings, and then have folks transfer in Springfield, and the models just kill us when we transfer. So I think you're right. How you attack that is make sure that any equipment that you might purchase, even if you build a high-speed network from Norfolk up to Petersburg and Richmond, make sure that any equipment will be able to run through and meet our Northeast Corridor requirements, our technical specifications, so that you can run the entire train set through to Washington, New York, and Boston. That can clearly be done, but it needs to be thought up well in advance. For example, some of the tilt equipment that's being envisioned in the Midwest, obviously they don't have that issue. We could not operate in the Northeast Corridor. We have clearance restrictions, so a lot of double-decker equipment, we can't operate in the Northeast Corridor. I think it's absolutely critical for this group when planning that to make sure any equipment and any train sets that you would purchase. And we have a process in place in PREA to bring everybody together. Section 305 equipment standards committee's been established to make sure that anything you purchase, we can run through Northeast Corridor, because it is very important.
Other questions?
I want to just clarify, if I can, to the TPO, the trains that we just started, the one in Lynchburg and the one we will start in Richmond, are Northeast Corridor train sets. They can run up to, 130 plus or minus?
125.
125, thank you. We make sure that when we work with Amtrak to rehabilitate equipment, that the regional system trains that we're putting on in Virginia have the capability of running at higher speeds. So if we look at our 95 corridor that we're developing with CSX, that's a 90-mile-an-hour corridor. These trains will be able to achieve that without Virginia having to purchase new equipment.
Right, and one, these are diesel-electric powered trains up to Washington where we put on an electric motor. Those locomotives are good to 110, so we can't operate 125 all the way with today's fossil fuel locomotives that we use. 110, unless you're looking at electrification, with today's technology is the upper limit on our train sets now.
Another question, Tom?
Yeah, I'm not sure you're going to be able to answer this one because it runs down to CSX, but let me ask it anyway. I was doing okay until you talked about you got off the one seat, and then and if we're looking at an option here, somebody's going to end up with a two-seat. Way I read this, and I didn't quite follow you though, but I got it was rather negative input that if somebody had to get off a train to get on another train, that really was an inhibitor for them to use the train.
Yes, sir. That's been our experience. That's what the models indicate. We've seen that play out in reality. Now, there's an argument that transportation has become less and less convenient. Folks are more used to those types of inconveniences, and their sensitivity to that is lessened, so perhaps it's not as much as 50%, as we've seen in some cases that it has been.
Now, when you say 50%, the 50% of what? The ones that would ride it if it was just a
Yes, sir.
one seat?
That's correct.
Okay.
A penalty of almost 50% for those that would span that transfer, for example. If you were New York to Newport News, a transfer in Washington, according to the history that we've seen, would penalize that trip by as much as 50%. So we would lose almost half those riders. We could lose almost half those riders.
If we look at the high-speed rail, and let's just a what if we're coming out of D.C. to Norfolk, okay, to the 460 route, and you were talking about the standardization of equipment or meeting the equipment requirements for the route. So are you talking about a route that you would leave Washington and not stop until you got to Norfolk, or are you talking about something that stops in Petersburg or Richmond before it gets down there?
Yeah.
And what is the effect of just a stop as opposed to getting off the train?
Yeah, we obviously, I think you would have a number of stops.
Okay.
Who knows where, but obviously Richmond, Petersburg, and a number of other cities, Fredericksburg, where you may stop. The effect of that is, usually if we have a 79-mile-per-hour route, it takes us 4 or 5 minutes to stop that train, do the service work, and get on our way. If you're operating 110, obviously you lose more time from stopping. If it's a very busy stop, it may be 10 or 12 minutes. And that lengthens the trip time. And when we look at ridership and how competitive the mode is, obviously trip time is a big component. It's nowhere near the penalty of transferring where someone has to gather their belongings, step off the train, wait a half hour for another train. So the stops are okay. You want to limit stops. When you look at higher speed service, obviously you don't want to stop in every community because the marketability of that product for the endpoint passengers becomes less and less as you add travel time. But I was not referring to stops penalizing service that much. I was referring to actually physically transferring between trains.
Okay. And then when you talk about 150 miles an hour for a plane or a train, then you're really saying that's a high speed because the average is with the stops is going to drive that train speed down.
Oh, it will, and that's why I think it's critical to look at average speed when you're building a corridor. And top speed really doesn't matter. It's neat to see things blurring by the window and say we've been 150 miles per hour, but at the end of the day, you average 66 miles per hour. That's what determines the trip time. That's what's the most important. In European high speed, true high speed, they build an entirely new corridor and they average very, very high speeds because they don't stop very often. They have very gentle curvature and grades, and they have powerful electric trains that can maintain those top speeds. And that's but the bottom line is that you have to look at the average speed. It won't do you a lot of good to run 150 for 15 miles and then run 60 for the remainder of the trip.
And then when you talk about 15 minutes less or savings on a trip, Mayor Frayne and I were just talking about this, and if I understood the mayor correctly, we're talking a comparison of a road trip versus a rail trip, or are we talking, when you say, I'm going to say 15 minutes, is that just increased speed, average speed? Because it sounded like to me to get from a couple extra minutes is costing the millions of dollars in other words, if we're going to save 15 minutes, we're going to cost us billions of dollars.
Could.
And then so in the planning factor, though, that is not necessarily the route as so much as the stops.
It's a factor of both. When I was referring to the billions in the Northeast Corridor, obviously that's a build-out, a very complex network. Just to get out and work on the Northeast Corridor requires a lot of time and train annulments and those types of things. So it's not always that big an expense per minute, but you have to look at all of that. I mean, the number of stops add minutes, just like having infrastructure that doesn't allow high-speed operations add minutes. No minute, to a passenger, a minute's a minute. Whether or not you save that minute because you lessen a curve for $30 million, or you save that minute because you don't stop somewhere. To them, that's a minute.
And my final question, Mr. Chairman, is finally getting to putting these pieces together. If I look at the peninsula and I look at the 460 route, my take is that the peninsula is going to have more stops, or unless it's a dedicated, okay, you're going from D.C. through Richmond and then to Newport News, you got to bypass Williamsburg, a lot of steps, and that's going to affect the ridership. And if I look at the way I don't know if it's because it's just a long route and a nice red line that's straight, but I get the impression there are much fewer stops on the south route, which would imply a more desirable route for the passenger.
I can answer that, Mr. Chairman. Coming out of Norfolk, we have Norfolk, Bowers Hill, Petersburg, and Richmond. Coming out of Newport News will be Newport News downtown, Williamsburg, and Richmond. So you'll have fewer stops actually.
On the peninsula? Okay, well, that's a...
And as well, Mr. Chairman, while I have the floor, if I can just to kind of clarify the things that have overheard. All of our trains that we're contemplating are single-seat run trains, whether it be an NEC regional train, the ones that we're starting. You get on to Richmond, get on Lynchburg, Newport News. We contemplate if we do come to Norfolk, it'll be a single-seat ride either New York or Boston. So that's our goal. It's kind of a bar we've set in Virginia. We don't like to transfer people, especially as Jeff mentioned. It's terrible on ridership and terrible on customer confidence when you have to get off the train and change trains.
Hey, Mr. Harrell.
Yeah, I think it's going to be important that we really
It's kind of an interesting...
We're not trying to get to the corridor from ourselves. We're not trying to get to fight amongst ourselves and end up disadvantaging this region. But when you really look at the population base, the economic drivers, maybe there's an opportunity that we can enhance rail service to the peninsula while also providing a direct route as well to the south side. And maybe Dwight can help us with this. Is it possible that you could designate the peninsula as an enhanced inner-city passenger rail route, and given the linear nature of the south side, maybe a high-speed route there, and then the customer has the opportunity, depending on where they're headed, to have maximum availability to get where they need to go? I mean, does it have to be either or? I mean, isn't there something here for the region which we all can agree on?
Dwight, then Mayor Frey.
I think what Mr. Harrell's getting at, and I think it's where we want to go in this item number 4, as to whether or not we're at a point where we can take action is, do we have the option as an entire region to have both, as Mr. Harrell's talking about? I think, Kevin or someone else, Mr. Mann, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think in our strategic plan position, we can. We could designate a high-speed rail corridor, and we could designate, from our perspective as a region, a corridor where we'd like to have enhanced, and I think the definition needs to be explained. Enhanced is more train sets, higher frequency, higher reliability in the inner city passenger rail system. Now, one point that I would point out here is I think we may find ourselves in a unique situation with this geographic split in that it might provide us with the opportunity to have both. As a region, that if you're in Newport News and you need high-speed rail to the Boston metro area or New York or in that corridor, you could choose the high-speed rail corridor. If you needed had an appointment at 11 or 2 or 12 o'clock, you could go to the inner-city passenger rail system in the other corridor and make that trip in a business day and do both. So you have both options. And I'd hate for us to forget that we might have that opportunity depending on what action you might be willing to take in terms of an agreed-upon position later on in this discussion.
Paul?
Well, just, and I don't want to argue the point with you, Kevin, but the stops are not necessarily the determinative issue here. I mean, the straightness of the path certainly permits the trains to go faster, as opposed to many curves and bends, in the route. And you please, disabuse me of this notion, because it's been on the south side route, the 460 route, we're trying to get to the corridor that would allow us to pick up the southeast or the northeast, corridor. We pick it up in Petersburg. We don't pick it up in Richmond. And you continue to say, well, for some reason that the south side corridor should be charged with the cost of Richmond to Petersburg, even though, isn't it true that a number of people have applied for funds to pay for that, including North Carolina?
Yeah, certainly, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mayor Frame. The question was, why do we keep commenting in this document that we need to include from Petersburg to Richmond when North Carolina DOT and also DRPT have applied for stimulus funds, obviously, for this overlapping piece of railroad. Remember, this is an environmental document that's setting a route and a corridor, and we have selected from Main Street Station Richmond to Newport News or Main Street Station Richmond to Norfolk. yes, I will go on record, we have separated in the EIS document, the draft when it comes out, what those costs could be, so that if there is an error award between now and the time this document is through, we understand that those costs will be absorbed by the Southeast Corridor Initiative and not the Hampton Roads Extension. So the answer is we felt that we needed to at least have what we call an operable segment all the way to Newport News and also to Norfolk for study purposes for the environmental document. However, we understand and we acknowledge in that document that it is a separate cost that's part of the Southeast Corridor Initiative. So thank you for asking for that, but we do separate those costs.
Mr. Chairman. Question for Mr. Page and perhaps Mr. Kendall. Is there additional work that is required in addition to what is already in the round one application that is required, necessary at the emerging level to serve both the south side and the peninsula? Okay, you understand my question?
I'll answer that first. If we're to start services in the Norfolk area up, we still have to negotiate with Norfolk Southern and CSX to start that service. Contemplatively, through the framework agreements that we have, there will have to be an operations and facilities analysis that would have to take place both with Norfolk Southern and with CSX in the Commonwealth as to how we go about that process of setting forward that. Once those improvements are identified, say for example for conventional rail or for higher speed rail, then we have to move forward with the strategy of identifying those projects, identifying the funding, and actually building those projects. So that the answer is between Petersburg and Richmond there will have to be negotiations, and also from Petersburg to Norfolk there would have to be negotiations, as well as they would be from Richmond to Newport News if that service was to begin over on your side of the river in Williamsburg.
Is there additional work required for Main Street Station heading north that's required in order to make any type of emerging service available to any place on Hampton Roads?
That's correct, and that's a very good question. The question is what happens at Main Street Station? We have a plan in place and contemplated that we're working through with CSX and our partner in the city of Richmond, where currently today there's only one platform and one track at Main Street Station. We're trying to develop a process of an east and west side train service that currently does not exist today. That's part of the Track 2 application that went in October 2nd, Mr. Chairman, members of the TPO, as to how we will work through that.
Thank you. Any other questions of our speaker? No need to have him standing up there if there aren't any.
Just want to make one quick comment with regard to stops. I don't want to leave you with the impression that you eliminate all stops. Stops give everybody an opportunity to use the service, but the market analysis has to drive which stops are beneficial.
I understand that, but isn't that one of the reasons that you talked about the incremental approach sort of gaining favor, that you start out, for instance, like we talked with Norfolk Southern about starting out at 79 miles an hour, hopefully growing into a high speed, the high-speed rail corridor that would be improved over time, over decades, right?
Perhaps, yes.
Dwight?
Jeff, could you confirm the conversation I think you and I had briefly, and I had also with Mr. Gardner with Amtrak, that Amtrak believes to play the federal game, you first need to tell the federal folks what is your ultimate strategic plan, and then we engage in the discussion of those incremental approaches on how to get there. Did I understand that correctly? Is that the way you're advising that we move this thing?
It is, and I think what you're referring to is a service development plan. And all of our applications, Track 2 to corridor applications, require a service development plan, and that has outcomes in the out years as well. So you have to decide what you want to be when you grow up, and then put those steps on how you're going to get there incrementally. Or maybe you're going to get there, like, for example, planned services in California, you're going to get there in one big shot, perhaps. But you're exactly right. You have to have a long-range service development plan that would not only say the endpoint, the desired endpoint, but also the steps to get there with a realistic time frame. So that's absolutely right.
So, Mr. Chairman, FRA first wants to hear where we want to be when we grow up, and then they want us to demonstrate all of the incremental steps that we are prepared to go forth, partner with you, DRPT, et cetera, to get to that point.
Yeah, those are the components of a service development plan. That is the key element, the service development plan of a Track 2 corridor application. That's correct.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my understanding that there are a couple of resolutions out. to be talked about and discussed? Do I have anyone to bring one up?
In some material you got, the organization got before the meeting today, the City of Norfolk was prepared to offer a resolution. Today, when I came here, I found the resolution that Dwight has put together.
Yes.
And I'm glad to pull the City of Norfolk's suggested resolution and use yours to work as a
Well,
working.
I felt like staff owed it to you if you asked, had we thought about it. We have one, but I can put on the screen.
No, I don't think so. I'm glad to pull ours. I mean, I'm comfortable with yours.
I can pull any of the three up. We'll retain an original so we don't mess that one up, and we can pull any one of the three.
Let's go with yours, so Mayor
Listen
Bumpus
to
should look at yours.
Pull mine. Yours is fine. Dwight.
Okay, so let's put Art's up there. I mean, Dwight's up there. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
It's so difficult in your life trying to get.
And we can fiddle with this on the fly. Just give us a little time to punch it up, but it's available for us to work with.
Certainly. Alan?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. For the sake of the process, is it possible, knowing that there's potentially several drafts out there, can we possibly have at least a motion if we agree, or at least have a motion by somebody initially, and depending on that particular draft, get a second, obviously, vote on that particular draft, and if that's carried, then any other draft can have amendments added to that, and then when we finish, depending on where it's at, then vote on the completed draft. If it's all possible, maybe that would help the process. If not, I'll just certainly sit by and listen.
Is that from this one?
I guess it is. It's a little convoluted.
Because we might wind up getting involved in every single draft and having incredibly lengthy discussions that can go on for an incredibly long period of time. And if that's what the body wishes, I certainly sit through the entire thing.
It's not, I don't think that's what the body wishes at all.
Chair style.
Any comments pertaining to Mayor Krasnoff's suggestion? We'll try that.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Crane. We probably disagreed at that moment.
Well, is there a motion for the resolution that's up there? I've got a motion. Do I have a second?
This particular motion is the one that I'm understanding basically relates to alternative one on the document. Is that my understanding, Mr. Singh?
Is this the one that Dwight drafted?
This is the one staff draft, independent of any of the others that have surfaced.
Yes.
And you're trying to take the substance of the two resolutions and combine them with this, is that right? Is that accurate?
Well, I'm telling you how it got developed. It got developed independently of the other two resolutions that you had before you.
Okay.
The similarities or dissimilarities were not derived from staff review of the others.
Well, why don't we first review this one and see if there's a motion. If the make of the motion would rescind it for a moment, Mr. Chairman, and at least see what he says.
Are you sure?
Oh,
Okay.
no, please, I just want to make
Okay.
I saw Mrs. Crane walk off, I didn't know if he heard.
I'm glad to move the adoption of
Okay.
of
I just want to make sure
the
that-
motion. Right. That's-
So we already have a motion on the floor from Mr. Cosgrove. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a second. Discussion, please.
I wanted to confirm, Mr. Chairman, that this resolution is the alternative one from the draft. It's bounced off with alternative one from the draft to get an answer to it. Yeah.
The enhanced Mr. Chair, if I could, the enhanced inner
High-speed rail on the 460 South Side corridor and enhanced intercity passenger rail service on the CSX Peninsula.
And the reason why I think that's so important, particularly for the peninsula, is that perhaps you can get more than just the original one that alternative one addresses. I mean, I think you could get significant.
Yeah, I don't think there's any limitation on how enhanced it can become. It's just a matter of, as Mr. Mann said, what do the market analysis say, and so forth. And what's the demand? Do we need more frequency? And then how much does it cost to add another train set, et cetera?
Okay, may I be specific, because I just want to make sure everyone is looking at the same thing. I'm going to read the body. Now therefore be resolved that Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization endorses the designation of a high-speed rail corridor along the Norfolk Southern Route 460 corridor, designated ultimately at speeds of more than 110 miles per hour. 2, the HRTPO enhances the intercity passenger rail service along the CSX I-64 corridor. 3, that the HRTPO establishes a regional high-speed rail task force. Is that the one that everyone is agreeing that we're looking at right now?
Yes.
I'm assuming so. Very good.
Mr. Chairman, help me understand exactly the purpose of the resolution is to go in the record for the EIS and for consideration of the CTP when they make the determination. Is that's going to be who's going to actually the target of the resolution is for, correct?
Mr. Chairman.
Right.
Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong here. And Kevin and I talked a little bit about this yesterday. We don't know for sure when this EIS gets released. We don't know for sure when the 30-day clock clicks, and we don't know when for sure the CTB is going to be staged to take action. What this gives you is an insurance policy that you can clearly now communicate to DRPT, to the CTB, and to FRA what your position is as a region, regardless of when that EIS comes out. If it comes out in 2 weeks, that's fine. We can segue right into that process. If there's a further delay, then this action really does stand out there alone without the benefit of this. And given this window closing on grant applications, my instinct tells me you want to be out there with this message.
Dennis?
Mr. Chairman, if I could ask Mr. Page, is there any unintended consequences by us adopting this type of resolution either to the CTB or to the Federal Railroad Administration?
Now, I'll answer that. The question was, are there any ramifications, implications from the federal and environmental level on this? And I had correspondence back and forth with FRA about this. They seem to feel that having this focus will help keep things moving rather quickly. When we go out for the public information period, it would allow a representative of the TPO to bring this resolution forward to public comment without having to hold another meeting and have that potential delay.
Thank you very much. Bruce,
I think all this makes sense, and I can certainly support this today. I just want to make sure that the TPO is going to be on record at some point when there's a decision made that we need to get behind that decision, even though that decision may or may not be what this resolution states.
I think that makes sense.
But clearly, I think it's a benefit to the region if this solution was, we went forward with this. I don't think it's clear.
Any other comments?
I really want to thank you for calling a special meeting today. Obviously, it's very important. Great response we've had, great public comments we've had. Really show how important this issue is, and I think a really wonderful push things forward. My only concern is we just got the resolutions yesterday. We haven't had time to really contemplate these things, and I'm worried there's unintended consequences, like Dennis said, that we may not be aware of. And I understand we need to move quickly and we need to move decisively, but my question is whether or not we need to do it today. And whether or not, if we did make the decision at our November board meeting, which I think is like 3 weeks, whether or not that would hurt us. I'm not suggesting that we spend 6 months discussing this, but I haven't had a chance to review this with my counsel, and I'm just concerned that there might be something I'm binding us to or unintentionally giving something away. I don't disagree with it theoretically at all, but I just want to make sure that I'm making an informed decision. And based on all the questions that I've heard here today, there's still a lot of unanswered questions. We're getting educated, and a lot of us have gotten, I know I've learned a lot today, and I think other people have too, and I just hate to make a rash decision, not knowing that I carefully considered it, and everything that could be a consequence I know about.
Stan. Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Please.
Yeah, I appreciate what Ms. Ward said, and I know we got a time limit here, and I feel that sense of urgency, but one of the things I'm real concerned about, I just hit some surface questions, and I had a lot of questions. I still don't know the ramifications. I know this is the step A for us, going to your step A, and I understand that part, but I'm not 100%. I just got this, actually, 2 of these resolutions I saw when I walked in here, okay? And I haven't had a chance to even talk with only one of my other board members. And if there was some way that we could maybe get, I don't know, a couple of weeks or just something to do that, then we could press on.
I think if I could just interject a comment, and I'll be very brief. I respect all the comments that were just made, but I guess if I sit back and look at what the slide I keep looking at, is the slide that shows Washington, D.C. going to Raleigh. And I will sit back and tell you that it almost angers me how Hampton Roads could have just been left out of this picture completely. We can't look back. I don't know how that occurred, but as I've heard the presentations and I've heard from staff members, it truly appears the train has left the station. And whereas I respect the comments that have been made, I don't know that we do have time. I do think we need to send some signals as to what direction we need to take. And again, I'm going to be supportive of whatever the outcome of this resolution is, but I would hope that we take action. I do believe that it really does come as close as it can to be accommodating to all. And that would be my recommendation, but any other comments?
I agree with you completely. I'd also, just in terms of a cleanup, and I just want to make sure I understand what the second item's saying, to be consistent under the, be it resolved, that the HRTPO enhances the intercity passenger rail. Shouldn't it be that we endorse the enhancement of that? We're not going to enhance it, are we?
You're right.
Okay.
You're right, Doug.
Okay. Endorse is fine.
Endorses the enhancement.
Okay, that change is made. Please.
Just a comment. Certainly support the resolution. There's no real mention in it, though, of the partnership that's required with the various parties, the state and the railroad, for use of whichever rail structure it is, which is, I guess, Norfolk Southern. But just a little bit concerned about weaving something in there with regard to freight. I've got a couple of suggested things that don't change the content, but just a whereas clause to toss in there.
What would that be?
Well, it's just whereas any use of private rail infrastructure requires an agreement between the railroad, the Commonwealth, and the rail service provider. I think if we're going on an incremental approach, I would understand that the first phase would probably be a diesel approach, and then in the future it would go to electric,
Any comments pertaining to that? Any objection to that? Let's add that in there.
That's a whereas. Jeff, you want us to punch that up, right?
Yeah, I can hand it to someone.
Pitch.
We're doing it over here.
Okay.
We'll get that.
Dennis, did you have a comment then? Linda? Dennis? Linda?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of piggyback on what you and Doug have said. I think that it's very important for us to move forward. 5 months is a very, very short period. Like you say, we're already kind of behind the 8 ball. I think what we're doing here is sending a message. If we don't designate, if you read this chronology of high-speed rail corridors, if we don't have a designation, we're not going to have anything. So we don't know where to go from here, and I think we need to move forward as quickly as possible.
Any other comments? Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, my concern is that we do not, if you just read this, it doesn't say we really want both alternatives. I would suggest that on number 2, that we say the HRTPO also resolves that in conjunction with the high-speed rail service, we enhance the intercity passengers, so they know that we want both.
Any objection?
Could you roll back to the resolve part? Because to me, we say that.
Does anyone object to that? Okay. That's fine. That's added. Any other questions or comments?
Mayor, I would just say that I think it's of paramount importance that we move forward with this. I'll give Mr. Chairman's better citation, but the General Assembly is going to be going back into session in relatively short order, and I think it's really important that this be one of our priorities from this entire region. And we've been talking about it for a year. We said, oh, trains left the station. Train, we were saying that a year ago. So if that was the case, it would be all the way over to Spain by now. We need to have this done. We need to go forward with this. The feds need to know we're serious about it. Richmond needs to know we're serious about it.
Very, very great comments. Any other comments before we call for the question? Can we have the read one time with all the changes, please, Dwight?
Read. Want to read down through all the way?
I'm not that, don't want that much
Thank you.
pain.
Thank you. Let's bring it on up a little further. We're going just to the near, therefore be resolved.
Keep going.
Other way. Go to, yeah, get out. There we go.
Yeah, hold
Okay.
tight.
Therefore be it resolved that the Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization, HRTPO, endorses the designation of a high-speed rail corridor along the Norfolk Southern / Route 460 corridor designated ultimately at speeds of more than 110 miles per hour, that the HRTPO endorses the enhancement of intercity passenger rail service along the CSX / I-64 corridor, and that the HRTPO establishes a regional high-speed rail task force.
That is the motion on the table. Any other discussion before we call for the question?
Final, did want to make sure that captures what Senator Miller.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I don't think it does.
I don't think it does either. So I think we'll make sure that clear that we want both options. That was the part that he was trying to make. And what we've got here is, I see the clearly stating of the high-speed rail, and that's okay with the 460. We need that second. We want
I
the
think
other
we're
option.
working on it right now. Give us a
Okay.
second here.
All right.
Mr. Chairman, shouldn't there be a whereas in the beginning of the document saying something about the EIS process? If this document is supposed to go as part of that process, shouldn't we have a whereas saying this is,
I think this is going to be taken. Go ahead.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, maybe I might suggest that maybe this also be an enabling resolution that authorizes someone to transmit this during the public comment period. Authorizes the chairman or his representative to carry this forward.
Yeah, this document is specifically for that process. Maybe that should be stated in the document.
Okay.
Would not we authorize the chair to do that?
I think that,
That's just probably self-serving.
I believe that's done.
Yeah, but otherwise, this document is still floating out there after that process is over, and really, if this conflicts with whatever that decision is, we want to be clear that this was in advance of that.
Okay, I'm going to put that on hold 1 second. I want to make sure we got the last thing fixed.
Tom, did you get a chance?
Okay, Senator Miller, are you okay with this part?
Yes, sir.
Good.
Okay.
I'm okay with it.
Thank you. Then, I'm sorry, Bruce. What you're trying to say is you want this to enable the chairman or his designee to represent.
To enter this in the official record for the EIS.
Sure.
And further be resolved that this is entered in the official record for the EIS decision and to be considered by the Commonwealth Transportation Board during its deliberation to determine the high-speed corridor, something of that nature.
We're adding it now.
I want to compliment the staff for keeping up with everybody.
Get this one, I'm going to be impressed.
Doing a much better job than I could do.
But Mr. Chair, I understand that, but at the same time, this is an action that the TPO is going to vote on. This isn't to expire in 45 days.
No.
I just want to be clear that, if the TPO at some future point has further deliberations and decides on a separate position, just like any other board, they can do that. I just don't understand the significance of what.
Well, I would hate for the TPO to be in conflict with CTB. When the CTB goes forward with a proposal for a corridor, if it's not in agreement with this document, is that the position the TPO wants to be in?
Well, I think the CTB determination.
It happens all the time.
So I don't agree. I think we need to be united.
Well,
We make this application for
Further in the future.
and I want to make, I think by doing this, we make it clear that this is part of that process.
Okay. Mr.
Mayor
Frame.
Bruce, in the resolution that we prepared originally, we had a whereas clause that read, whereas an approved final environmental impact statement is necessary for the development of a high-speed, IPR strategy for Hampton Roads. Is that the kind of language you're talking about?
Well, I think it's better. We're saying specifically what the resolution is for.
Well, this resolution would be for more than just that.
Yeah,
I don't understand.
Mr. Chair, I don't know that we want to restrict ourselves. This is, as of today, this is our resolution for the TPO.
I agree.
We can change that if we want to change another time, but today, this is it.
All right, does anyone object? Bruce, I hear you.
Yeah.
If that were to be pulled, out. Other than Bruce, does anyone object to that statement being pulled out? Okay. The ones that Bruce just added.
We have asked versus.
Oh, yeah, well, added?
No, we didn't.
It is.
Oh.
They did.
Oh, this
I watched them do it.
Well, that was.
And again, the reason is
That
that
was-
we want to support whatever decision comes out of the process with CTV. If we want to make an application that the region supports. And I don't want any misconstrue that if that decision is different than this resolution, that we no longer agree with that.
Delegate Cosgrove.
I would just say that there's no way that I want to bind this group to blankly support what the CTV comes up with. The CTV sent all the interstate funds to Northern Virginia.
I'm going to suggest that.
It doesn't bind the group, it just says that.
All right, folks, I'm going to suggest that be removed unless, anyone else? Senator?
In the draft that was prepared by the city of Norfolk with additional comments from the city of Hampton, there's a section in here talking about the relocating the Newford News Station or downtown Newford News and construction of new stations in downtown Norfolk and Bowers Hill. Is that necessary to include in this?
Not in here. No, it's necessary.
Any other discussion before we make this historic vote?
We have to go to a vote, we'll go to a voting screen.
Okay.
If you're ready with this.
Let's call for the question.
Okay. Dr. Krasnoff.
Yes.
Ms. Riley. Mayor Ward.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mr. Goodson.
Yes.
Mr. Frank. Mayor Frame.
Yes.
Mr. Smith.
Yes.
Mr. Helson. Mayor Johnson.
Yes.
Mayor Sessoms.
Yes.
Mayor Zeidler. Chairman Shepherd.
Yes.
Senator Miller.
Yes.
Senator Miller.
Which Miller?
Senator Yvonne Miller.
Yes.
Delegate Oder. Delegate Cosgrove. Mr. Towns or his alternate.
Yes.
Mr. Rickards.
Yes.
Mr. Hewer.
Yes.
We, I think, have cleared the hurdle necessary to have affirmative action.
Thank you all very much. Before I conclude, I want to thank everyone for their hard work today. We went past 1:30, but I think we got something accomplished.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Port Authority. We actually, DRPT.
Hold on, please, quiet, please.
Sorry. Mr. Hill, or DRPT.
I don't know whether I'm authorized to vote. Who else is here anyway? I'll say yes.
Okay. And Virginia Port Authority, Mr. Florin is alternate?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, before you hit that hammer, I want to thank you for all of your hard work. I know that this has been a hard, difficult thing to get through.
We were very kind, but I appreciate everyone for everything they did today. Thank you so much. Adjourned.